This video is about Empire of Ash, the upcoming Doom of Valyria prequel TV series to Game of Thrones. It's the second of 3 faction profile videos I'm making, and this one is on the major faction known as the Sphinxes. A few weeks ago, first week of July, I posted a big leak report about Empire of Ash on Game of Thrones Wiki, where I'm an administrator. But I'm faced with the tension of, on the one hand, I want to promote this show, make sure it gets picked up, but on the other hand, I don't want to give out too many huge spoilers. That I know a lot of stuff now that I didn't put in that public report, because they were too big. So after a while thinking on it, I realized I can make a video clarifying what I already said, and providing context from the books. For all the people who haven't read the books yet, things about Valyria which are mentioned or foreshadowed in it that the TV series never even touched on. So the way these videos are structured is I'll keep referring back to and citing specifically what I already said in that first leak report, and providing book quotes to give you some context for it. And you'll see that as I go forward. But I hope it gives you a better sense of what's going on, because some of the initial reactions I saw to the first leak online didn't quite get what I was trying to say, which I thought was obvious from the way I worded the original report. But this will clear up everything as we go. And that whole citation format, it really touches on how it felt the writers of this project were approaching it. If the series Bible I saw is anything to go by, that this sense of stewardship of this is something that should build on what the books did and plausibly fit within that continuity. That it's not, oh, well, the books are the books and the show are the show. It felt like they were proud when something in the show wasn't their idea, when it was something Martin came up with, that the series Bible would fixate on, this is something Martin said already in the novels, and we're developing it from that. And we know Martin did contribute significantly to this. He's not a staff writer, but it says in the series Bible they had about half a dozen big sit-down meetings with him. Many hours long, like whole day meetings. They had about half a dozen of those, where he shared with them stacks of unpublished notes on pre-Doom Valyria. Some of it was written out in handwritten notes or typed or whatever. Some of it was stuff that was always in his head, but he just never put pen to paper before. And some of it's stuff that when he actually sat down to brainstorm new ideas, they're ideas of his that he then told them when he sat down to think of what was pre-Doom Valyria like. I'm not sure exactly what the mix is of when Martin came up with these ideas, but a lot of it comes from Martin himself, in broad strokes. I'm not sure if every single character down to the second and third level was his idea. The POV characters, I was never told this was his idea on any one point, but he at least gave the go-ahead on, like, characters who are described in the series Bible. He has seen the series Bible and likes it. But in terms of, this is the political setup, the political landscape of pre-Doom Valyria, I'm reasonably sure these are ideas Martin himself came up with, because they fit so well with things that were already being hinted at in the main novels that I keep wondering, is this something he just never told us before? Other things where they've got, people have asked, like, when did you first get the idea about the three-eyed raven? And he said, oh, since, like, book 2. And that only came up in book 5, that over 10 years before, he'd thought out some of these things that he just didn't share publicly. He planned this out. It's a book series. So we shall see. That at least some of this, in broad strokes, is probably book canon. On the level of a faction profile, this stuff is probably accurate. And exemplifying that was the way my source, over a 2-hour video chat, introduced me to things, was to ask me Socratic questions, because they knew I had read the novels, I work on an online encyclopedia, I know reasonably well everything, it's public at least, that they go, what do we know about how Valyria did religion or politics? And I go, well, they said this and this about, and they go, exactly, and then say, and this is how the series Bible builds on that. And there's block quotes from like the World Book in it that I can remember. Oh yeah, they said that in the World Book. Point I'm building up to is when my source started describing the factions, they asked me Socratically, in the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, what symbol were the Valyrians famous for other than dragons? And I paused for a moment in shock a little and went, the Sphinxes. And they went, exactly, and whipped open the series Bible to the chapter page on the Sphinxes as a faction. So it's not just, oh, they were verbally over the pure audio over the phone playing me along. This was a video chat. They were holding the series Bible and instantly whipped it out to a page with concept art of Sphinxes on it, titled The Sphinxes. And there was another page that had every faction listed off on it with their concept art. So it was just to set me up for, we didn't make this up out of thin air. If you, a book reader, had to guess what another symbol of Valyria was, you'd go, oh, well, the Sphinxes. And they matched that. Why do I say that as a book reader if you haven't? Well, it turns out since the first novel, mention has been made of Valyrian Sphinxes. They start getting particularly prominent in the fourth and fifth novels, but I went back and checked. They've mentioned that phrase, Valyrian Sphinx, since the first book, 1996. Not just Sphinxes in general, this is important, but Valyrian Sphinxes, a distinct association. What I already said in the original leak report was that the Sphinxes are the conservative faction of Valyria's Dragon Lords. My source used the exact phrase to describe them, that they want to make Valyria great again. And this may surprise you, but I personally think they're actually the most interesting faction. And by the end of this video chat, they were the faction I wanted to know the most about, because they're very intriguing. And if that sounds strange to you now, I hope by the end of the video you'll get some sense of why I came to think that way. So, introduction section out of the way, now moving forward section by section in this video. First part, Valyrian Sphinxes. The TV show did not mention this at all. They cut this down to nothing. That it's actually been throughout the novels, and even I was surprised. I remember it from like the fourth novel. It is a phrase that has been around since the first book. So I said I'm going to be giving citations and context that is already publicly known. This is what the books have to say about Valyrian Sphinxes. Most book readers, when you go, oh, what's another symbol of Valyria, could probably guess. Oh yeah, like Sphinxes, I guess. A Game of Thrones, first book, Eddard, chapter 4. The chamber was richly furnished. Mirish carpets covered the floor, and in one corner 100 fabulous beasts cavorted in bright paints on a carved screen from the Summer Isles. The walls were hung with tapestries from Norvos and Qohor and Lys, and a pair of Valyrian Sphinxes flanked the door. Eyes of polished garnet smoldered in black marble faces. So these are prominent big statues at the entrance to the small council chamber in King's Landing. So every subsequent time people come to the small council, they usually remark on in passing there's these big Sphinx statues in the room, Valyrian Sphinxes. Same book, first book, Sansa chapter 4. They found Queen Cersei in the council chambers, seated at the head of a long table littered with papers, candles, and blocks of sealing wax. The room was as splendid as any that Sansa had ever seen. She stared in awe at the carved wooden screen and the twin Sphinxes that sat beside the door. And this goes on throughout the series. Then in Book 2, A Clash of Kings, the first Tyrion chapter, when he walks into the small council for the first time, Tyrion Lannister shouldered through the door, feeling almost tall. 5 members of the king's small council broke off their discussion suddenly. "You!" his sister Cersei said in a tone that was equal parts disbelief and distaste. Then Tyrion says, "I can see where Joffrey learned his courtesies." Tyrion paused to admire the pair of Valyrian Sphinxes that guarded the door, affecting an air of casual confidence. But Sphinxes start getting mentioned more prominently in the fourth and fifth novels, and this might be foreshadowing, but A Feast for Crows, Book 4, Chapter The Reaver, Euron had seduced them with his glib tongue and smiling eye, and bound them to his cause with the plunder of 100 distant lands. You give out gifts and largesse and plunder when you're at the Kingsmoot, when you're one of the candidates. He won them over with his gifts of plunder, gold and silver, ornate armor, curved swords with gilded pommels, daggers of Valyrian steel, striped tiger pelts and the skins of spotted cats, jade manticores, and ancient Valyrian sphinxes. But probably the ones that stand out most in memory to anyone who read the books are the Sphinxes at the Citadel, the headquarters of the Maesters in Old Town. All this was cut from the TV show. They're not from Westeros. They were brought to Westeros as just ancient archaeology statues brought from Essos. And they're mentioned quite a bit in the Old Town subplot that runs through the fourth book. Samuel chapter 5 of A Feast for Crows. The gates of the Citadel were flanked by a pair of towering green sphinxes. They're huge statues, with the bodies of lions, the wings of eagles, and the tails of serpents. One had a man's face, one a woman's. And the artwork I'm putting in here is like stuff based on the books for like Fantasy Flight card game artwork and stuff. This is a good piece of what the Sphinx statues in Old Town are supposed to look like. And also continuing in Samwell's storyline, and I think they're all linked, there's another point when they mention Sphinxes, that as Maester Aemon is dying, and he's in and out of delirium half the time because he's on his deathbed, he starts talking incoherently about things that you can kind of tell are foreshadowing of later big plot arc events, like the prince that was promised, the dragon has 3 heads, Azor Ahai, stuff like that. Exactly, it says, Samuel chapter 4, his talk was all a jumble. He spoke of dreams and never named the dreamer, of a glass candle that could not be lit, and eggs that would not hatch, dragon eggs. He said the Sphinx was the riddle, not the riddler, whatever that meant. He asked Sam to read to him from a book by Septon Barth, whose writings had been burned during the reign of Baelor the Blessed because they were about magic. Once he woke up weeping. The dragon must have 3 heads, he wailed, but I am too old and frail to be one of them. I should be with her, Daenerys, showing her the way, but my body has betrayed me. So this is some hint, foreshadowing of something on the level of the dragon has 3 heads, is the Sphinx is the riddle, not the Riddler. And then, end of the book, when Sam actually gets to Old Town, he meets a character in the Citadel called Alaris, who is assuredly one of the Sand Snakes in disguise, the 5th Sand Snake. Sorella, Alaris is Sorella spelled backwards, and that she's infiltrating the Citadel for reasons as yet unknown. This whole subplot doesn't appear in the TV series. And in the prologue, they explain that everyone calls her the Sphinx, calls him the Sphinx, that it had been Lazy Leo who dubbed Alaris the Sphinx. A Sphinx is a bit of this, a bit of that. A human face, the body of a lion, the wings of a hawk. Alaris was the same. His father was a Dornishman, his mother a black-skinned summer islander. His own skin was dark as teak. And like the green marble sphinxes that flanked the Citadel's main gate, Alaris had eyes of onyx. And then again, most recently, in the 5th novel, A Dance with Dragons, that the TV show truncated all of this, that when Tyrion goes on this epic quest east to meet Daenerys, from Pentos to Meereen, a lot of it is overland, that he has to go by way of Atlantis to take a ship to Meereen. So he spends a lot of time riding from Pentos to Volantis down the Rhoynar River by boat, and at the beginning he's riding a bit in a wheelhouse. And this is really the first time we had chapters that were set in the Free Cities extensively, not just Braavos. Braavos wasn't part of Valyria. So Tyrion is traveling through lands that were once part of the Valyrian Empire. So he's seeing all these Valyrian ruins all over the place. He's traveling down a Valyrian road. So this is the first time the narrative could actually comment on that. So in the second Tyrion chapter of Book 5, there's a scene where he sees, like Old Town, these big ruined statues of Valyrian Sphinxes by the road and calls them Valyrian Sphinxes as a phrase. That he sees one that's half ruined and covered in moss, and he's impressed by it, and next to it there's an empty place where its mate should have been, but it was dragged away by the Dothraki as a trophy or something, so that's in there too. And then by the 7th Tyrion chapter of A Dance with Dragons, when he gets to Volantis itself, the ancient gates to the Long Bridge, which were built by the Valyrians in Volantis, are carved with sphinxes. So this has been in the novels since the first one and got really prominent starting in the 4th one. And why is it that linked phrase? I've wondered on that now and again, but never really ascribed too much meaning to it. We've heard of a Lannister lion symbol. It's not just a lion, it's associated with Lannisters. And we've heard of a walrus in general. The books never mention a Lannister walrus as if they're associated. Lions are Lannister lions, they're associated with them. Similarly, we hear of Stark direwolves and of badgers in general, but never Stark badgers as if they're associated, ever across 5 huge novels plus prequel stuff like the World Book. Nor have we ever heard it mentioned in context of the First Men, their ancestors. Nothing has ever associated the Starks or the First Men with badgers. So what if a new prequel like the proposed Long Night prequel TV series suddenly said, oh, the original Stark symbol was a badger, and this is the story of how they switched to the direwolf? Please tell me in the comments how you would react to that if you're just making this up for the sake of changing things. That nothing ever even hinted at that in this entire corpus of material. And contrast that with just how much we've actually heard of Valyrian Sphinxes before. Since the first novel. Empire of Ash reveals that Sphinxes were the original symbol of the Valyrians before they discovered dragons. Back when they were humble shepherds. So in contrast to making up, oh, this is the original Stark symbol you've never heard of, my source asked me Socratically, oh, what do you think the symbol of Valyria was before it was the dragon? Like, the Valyrians who discovered dragons must have had some earlier symbol before they even knew of dragons. And just, yeah, they always mention Valyrian Sphinxes. So, if this sounds weird to you at first, just as I thought about it, I went, that fits really well, to the point I was wondering, is this an idea straight from Martin that he was setting up? The fact that even Maester Aemon is talking about Sphinxes for some reason. Is this something that's going to come out in the 6th novel? If you haven't really heard the explanation of Valyrian history, because they don't really go into it too much in the TV series, originally the Valyrians were this tiny, minor land of humble shepherds over on the eastern continent. They had no power, they were marginal, not even noteworthy, and then one day these shepherds, who were nestled into mountain valleys in a chain of volcanoes, one day, while tending their flocks, they stumbled on dragon eggs. And somehow, it's a mystery, they magically learned how to tame and bond with them. And adapt them as beasts of war, and to make Valyrian steel weapons forged in dragonfire and use it as a basis for their magic. Now, this is the world around them. The Valyrians are that big peninsula in the middle there. Westeros is over on the left. Zooming into a simplified map, you see there's Westeros over there. Valyria is that big peninsula. And they weren't even the whole peninsula, they were just the southern tip near this mountain chain. So these humble shepherds, gradually with dragons now, started conquering neighboring lands and expanding throughout their peninsula. Over time, this is about 6,000 to 5,000 years ago. The Long Night was 8,000 years ago, so this is a couple of thousand years after that. young Valyria was on the rise, and used its newly found dragons to expand into and conquer neighboring lands. And before long, this brought it into conflict with what had been the biggest land empire in Essos up until then, the old Giscari Empire to their east, which ruled vast swaths of land and planted a lot of colony cities as well, such as the ones in Slaver's Bay, like Marine. These were originally part of the Giscari Empire. Old Geese had vast, nearly endless lockstep legions of soldiers, but they couldn't stand up against dragons. They fought a series of 5 major wars with Valyria over the centuries, but it culminated in the 5th and final one when they lost, and all their people were dragged off into slavery and conquered and absorbed into the new Valyrian Empire. That was about 5,000 years ago. About 1,000 years ago, Valyria started turning its eyes from east to west against the Rhoynar people, who are the ancestors of the Dornishmen. They lived in the river network of the region that is now the Free Cities. The Free Cities themselves aren't Rhoynar cities that were conquered. They were Valyrian colonies that were planted as rivals to the Rhoynar and competed with each other. Cities such as Volantis, the first free city, which was a major Valyrian colony, the regional capital of a sort, and Pentos, which you may remember as locations we saw in the TV series. We saw the big long bridge of Volantis in Season 5, and Pentos is where Daenerys and Viserys start out in the beginning of the TV series, and then we see that again when Tyrion goes there. Now, the Rhoynar held out for a while, over 2 centuries, and they were brave warriors using water magic to counter the fire magic of Valyria, but ultimately, through attrition and just so many dragons, hundreds of dragons, they were finally and conclusively defeated, and Valyria absorbed all of the western end of Essos as well, from Volantis to Pentos. So at the end of the Rhoynar Wars, Valyria ruled this vast empire from Pentos in the west to Marine in the east, and a little beyond. And this was over 600 years before the Doom of Valyria, give or take. After that, they had no major enemies anymore, and their civilization flourished. They had half of the known world within their domain. The greatest empire the world has ever seen, the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. And Martin's writings have given a few descriptions of it. These are from the World Book and from a few interviews he did. Valyria, at the zenith of its power, right before the Doom, was neither a kingdom nor an empire, or at least it had neither a king nor an emperor. It was more akin to the old Roman Republic. That he said Valyria was basically Rome with dragons, and the free cities are like the subsequent Italian city-states that formed from its ashes. And this is from the World Book. In theory, the franchise included all freeholders, that is, freeborn landowners, could vote and wield political power. Of course, in practice, wealthy, highborn, and sorcerously powerful families came to dominate. So we already knew that. That's just context. And we already knew from other quotes that there were about 40 major families of dragon lords that dominated politics in Valyria, and it just vaguely said they had rivalries between different political factions among them. The new thing we learn in Empire of Ash is that there were 2 big factions of dragon lords in Valyria: the Sphinxes and the Young Dragons. Now, this isn't official artwork I was given. It's my best attempt to recreate from memory the heraldry that I was shown in the series Bible. That I got the best look at the Sphinx one, and the Young Dragons one, I remember it looked like the Targaryen sigil, but I got a blurry look at it, so it might not look exactly like it. Looks like a clear precursor at the very least. That maybe it was a dragon with 1 head. I'm not sure. but because I can't draw, I'm using the current Targaryen sigil as a placeholder for it. It might turn out to be literally the same sigil, but if or when this show gets announced and you start seeing heraldry from it, it'll look similar to this. And as for the Sphinx sigil, okay, I messed this up if you saw some of my earlier posts about this. I said, oh, it's a Sphinx rampant, because I'm used to writing rampant. I don't know heraldry. I'm not a heraldry guy. That I'm used to writing a lion rampant, because that's what the Lannister sigil is. I had to look all this up. I don't know this. That it's in French, that a lion rampant means rearing up on its hind legs. What I actually saw is called a Sphinx couchant, which is lying down with the body resting on the limbs and belly, but its head raised. The pose that the real-life Sphinx of Egypt is in. So how did I make the symbol that you're seeing in this video? Well, from memory, I got a reasonably good look at it. And I remember that the art department for HBO, for Game of Thrones projects, usually tries to base heraldry in the TV series on real-life heraldry to make it look realistic, within that realm of what heraldry should look like. So, like, the Lannister lion is in direct imitation of heraldry from real-life medieval Europe. And if you look up, like, rarer animals, they just looked up in heraldry databases, okay, this is how we draw a fox. This is how to draw a bear, like the Mormont bear is clearly based on real-life heraldry. So, remembering what I saw, I didn't record it, I went into a heraldry database and looked up sphinxes. How does heraldry in real life traditionally represent a sphinx? And this isn't just what was in the heraldry book. I recognized it from what I had seen in the series Bible. So either I think it's the exact same one, because they usually use heraldry databases. And even if it isn't, it looks pretty darn close to what I saw, facing left, head raised in a sphinx pose. So it might even be the exact same one, but it's fairly close anyway. Again, fuzzy, like when you hear reports from live reads of Martin doing a live read of the World Book, and we get bits and pieces of information someone jotted down. The details are a little fuzzy, but generally this is what the two symbols look like, or at least I'm using them as placeholders in this. So, I've said before, the two big factions are the Sphinxes and the Young Dragons. What's the difference between them? We learn in Empire of Ash that the Sphinxes are the descendants of the original Valyrian aristocracy, the original nobles and priests when they were humble shepherds. This tiny community of humble shepherds, this tiny little kingdom up in the mountains, who somehow learned to tame dragons with magic, and led Valyria during its original wars against the Giscari when they were a young upstart power. So the Sphinxes are the blue blood nobility, the old families, the upper aristocracy, the old guard families, born to the purple. The Young Dragons, in contrast, are the younger aristocracy, the lower aristocracy. They descend from common soldiers who became powerful warlords during Valyria's wars of conquest as it expanded outward. Soldiers and generals who grew rich from plunder and slaves as they were conquering the Giscari and then the Rhoynar and other peoples. So the Young Dragons are new men, nouveau riche. And this was exciting for me because this is exactly what happened to the old Roman Republic. You had the divide between the old aristocracy and the new men who got rich from the wars of conquest. In fact, the way it happened, talking to my source, because in the series Bible it summarizes this is like what happened to Rome, they were starting to summarize it to me verbally before they showed me the text saying this is like Rome. That they said, well, you see, the Sphinxes are the upper aristocracy, and the Young Dragons are the new men, lower aristocracy, and just the phrase new men is from Novus Homo, that's Roman. That they said, well, you see, it's like how in Rome, and I cut them off immediately and went, oh, they're like the Populares and Optimates of Marius and Sulla. And they went, oh, you know Roman history already. And I went, well, yeah, I minored in classics and I'm a medievalist and I know Latin and stuff. So it's just as the War of the Five Kings is loosely inspired by the medieval War of the Roses in England, it seems like Empire of Ash and the civil wars leading up to the Doom of Valyria are loosely inspired by the final civil wars that ended the Roman Republic. Though if you're asking, you don't know a lot about this, or asking, where's Julius Caesar and all this? This was a centuries-long series of conflicts. Caesar was like in the second generation of that fight. 40 years before that, when the civil wars really started in earnest, around the 80s BC, it was Marius versus Sulla, that the Optimates were the old aristocracy Senate faction. And the Populares, they weren't the popular front. They were new men who had gained aristocratic status but weren't of old lineages. It was the upper aristocracy versus the new lower aristocracy that got wealthy in the wars of conquest. And you actually see this division come up a lot in history. It's a historical pattern with colonial empires. This divide between the old aristocracy born and raised in the mother country, and then the younger aristocracy who, while ethnically the same, went out to become viceroys as soldiers in the new conquests, in the new colonies, and the old aristocracy looks down on them as upstarts. Loosely in the United States, it's sort of like how the British from Britain looked down on British colonists in the 13 colonies, that, well, you're colonists, and they're like, I'm not intermarrying with Native Americans or anything, I am ethnically exactly the same as you. What changed when I stepped off a boat here? But that loosely, because it wasn't as formalized in British North America. The real example, I think, kind of stands out. The biggest one is, of course, Rome. That's what it's directly modeled on. But if you're one of my viewers here from Latin America, that it's kind of how New Spain and Brazil were organized, that you have the old Spanish and Portuguese aristocracy in the Iberian Peninsula in Europe. Then you have all these soldiers, just common soldiers who left because they weren't aristocracy, who went out to be conquistadors in Latin America. And then, not the same people, it's generations and centuries later, their descendants had become powerful viceroys and provincial governors within the colonial empire. And the only real difference was their lineage wasn't as distinguished, so the old aristocracy looked down on them, even though they were arguably just as powerful. This painting, for example, is representing a family from Mexico in 1730, an aristocratic family from Mexico City, born and raised in Mexico City, who did not intermarry with local peoples. Ethnically, they were exactly the same as, like, old blood aristocrat in Madrid, in Spain, would look down on these provincial governors in Mexico City as, you're just a bunch of up-jumped soldiers who, with pretensions of grandeur, you're not real aristocrats like I am. I think the terms are Criollo and Peninsulars. I looked this up. There's this whole article on Wikipedia explaining the casta system, that the British colonies didn't have this, where they had this formal, declining category system of whiteness, where at the top were Spanish from Spain or Portuguese from Portugal, and then there were white people who were born in Mexico or born in Brazil, but were pure white. And then there were gradations below that of, well, you might have had one of your grandparents was Native American, and then two of your grandparents are Native American, and so on. There's these declining categories, but at the top, that even the uppermost aristocracy, there's a division between the upper and lower guys.